We all think we know the story of our daring and dangerous nuclear age. But separating the facts from the myths is as tricky as splitting the atom. And if you believe the top-secret Manhattan Project had nothing to do with New York, you're in for an explosive surprise. The history books say the Cuban Missile Crisis is the closest we've come to World War III. But the facts say a closer call came in 1984. And don't trust what you've heard about the president's nuclear football. Wait until you hear who else has one. I'm Jamie Kaler, and it's time to diffuse the myths and blast our way to the truth. On August 6th, 1945, Tsutomu Yamaguchi was on a business trip in Hiroshima when the U.S. dropped the first atomic bomb ever used in warfare. He survived, then returned home to Nagasaki. There he lived through a second nuclear blast. Although there may be others, Yamaguchi is the only person officially recognized by the Japanese government to survive both nuclear attacks. He lived to the age of 93. Most of his countrymen in the two cities, of course, weren't so lucky. An estimated 130 to 230,000 people die in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Not only from the initial blasts, but also by the poisonous radioactive fallout. At the time, the attacks are seen as a way to quickly end the war and possibly save as many as 1 million American lives. It's a chilling start to a nuclear age. But if you think only Japanese lives are lost in the atomic onslaught, you've entered the realm of fiction.
What was not known to the public until many years later was that there were some American prisoners of war, maybe a dozen, maybe more, who also perished in the attack on Hiroshima. In a sense, the ultimate friendly fire.
How did we get to this game-changing moment in history? Here's the story we've all heard. During the Second World War, scientists are feverishly at work on the enormously expensive Manhattan Project. It has nothing to do with Manhattan, but everything to do with knocking Japan out of the war. Under an impenetrable cloak of security, the test detonation at Trinity Site in New Mexico goes exactly as planned, paving the way for the U.S. to drop its bombs on Japan. Explosive myths abound in that summary, starting with the top-secret project's name.
Few people realize that Manhattan, New York was central to the project that bears its name, the Manhattan Project. It's hard to conceive of this today, but thousands of pounds of uranium were stored in Manhattan.
Manhattan is also home to an Army Corps of Engineers, the unit assigned to create the bomb. 5,000 employees work at its headquarters at 270 Broadway. And at nearby Columbia University, 700 scientists labored to discover the atom's secrets. So the project title we think of as strictly a code name is anything but. The reason we no longer associate Manhattan with the A-bomb's creation is that it quickly grows too big even for the Big Apple. It moves to additional sites at Hanford, Washington, Los Alamos, New Mexico, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And now that it's a nationwide project, America speeds ahead to build the bomb that will be our knockout blow against Japan. Right? Nope. Our real motivation is to outrace the Germans to the bomb.
We knew that Germany had a program underway before we did, and without having any real data or intelligence to tell us otherwise, we had to assume that they were further along in developing an atomic capability. And so that was really the driver.
But Germany surrenders before the bomb is tested. So our focus then turns towards ending the war with Japan. But one nerve-wracking question looms prior to the now famous Trinity test in New Mexico. will America's super expensive super weapon, based entirely on a new scientific theory, even work?
A woman over 100 miles away said, "What's that big bright thing in the sky?" And she was blind.
At the test site, the bomb detonates predictably and flawlessly, just as expected. Not quite. First comes a problem with the weather. A thunderstorm delays the test for a very tense 90 minutes.
Passing storm was a great cause of concern because they feared that rain could spread nuclear fallout, and they feared that lightning could even lead to a premature detonation, endangering everyone concerned.
The storm moves on, but the doubts linger.
There were internal bets that either it was going to be a total dud or it was going to blow up the world. It ran the full gauntlet.
And in the end, the test is a success. In fact, it exceeds expectations. The blast has the power of 20,000 tons of TNT. 4 times the amount the project's scientists originally calculated. In the decades to come, the bombs of the evolving nuclear age would make the ones dropped in World War II seem like firecrackers. And the only thing scarier were some truly harebrained schemes to try them out. Here's a pop quiz. How many nuclear test explosions have there been since the first one in 1945? 200? 300? 500? The real answer? More than 2,000. That's one fact about the nuclear age we wish were fiction.
In the old days, they were out there experimenting to see what a bomb would actually do because they didn't know what effects it would have on a building or a tank or something like that until they actually blew these bombs off.
Since those Wild West days of nuking just about everything we could think of, the dangers of the nuclear age have compelled most nations to stop test explosions altogether. Only North Korea has tested a nuclear bomb in the 21st century. Today, computer simulations have replaced the real thing. But back in the nuclear happy days of the 1950s, the old-fashioned way is the only way. The stories you've heard are so crazy, given what we now know about nuclear weapons, that they sound like fiction. But incredibly, most are fact, starting with Operation Plum Bob, a series of 29 nuclear tests in Nevada in 1957.
Frankly, those involved in Operation Plum Bob had no idea of the destructive force or the power of the fallout. Thousands of American soldiers were exposed to fallout as a result of Operation Plum Bob.
In Plum Bob and other tests at the Nevada test site during the 1950s, the military positioned soldiers in trenches, some even in the open. And during each nuke's blinding flash, some see the bones of their fingers through their cupped hands. Then, following orders, they march forward, straight into the blast site.
We were ignorant towards what radiation could do. And so this belief that you let the shock wave pass over you and then it's safe to walk towards the mushroom cloud is acceptable.
Among the veterans of these tests, thyroid cancer and leukemia skyrocket. In the 1990s, the government acknowledges its culpability, and over the past 25 years has compensated irradiated servicemen more than $2 billion. Another equally unbelievable project almost comes to fruition at the same time. How about the Air Force's scheme in 1958 to detonate a nuclear bomb on the moon? That's gotta be a whopper. But it's true. The top secret plan, called Project A119, is intended as the supreme display of military might at the height of the Cold War.
A119 is the brilliant idea to launch a nuclear missile at the moon, something that will cause a large enough explosion that people with the naked eye will actually be able to see in the night sky.
Why in the world would you do that except for its propaganda value? To show that we weren't losing the war for nuclear weapons, we weren't losing the war for space. Of course, this preposterous idea never came to fruition.
Interesting side note, the young scientist that we choose to measure the nuclear explosion, if this were to happen, is a young scientist named Dr. Carl Sagan.
In 1963, the escalation of nuclear testing worldwide results in the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. The treaty prohibits the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, underwater, or in outer space. But the treaty is no safeguard against nukes being used in the event of war. And incredibly, we've several close calls. Two incidents you've probably never heard of brought us to within an eyelash of launching World War III. Here are a few incredible numbers that sound more like fiction than fact. 1,000, the number of nuclear warheads in the US when Dwight Eisenhower became president in 1953. 18,000, the number of warheads when Ike left office in 1961. 60,000, the number of nuclear weapons on Earth in 1985. 15,000, the number of nuclear weapons today. And many of them are 80 times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. Nuclear age bomb testing has provided us some odd benefits, like a new technology to detect art forgeries. Before the first atomic blast in 1945, isotopes like strontium-90 and cesium-137 didn't exist on Earth. They're created during a nuclear explosion. If a painting claimed to be created earlier than 1945 possesses those isotopes, well, it's almost certainly a forgery. In the nuclear age, the scary news has always eclipsed the good. And the scariest reality of all is the threat of a nuclear Armageddon. Luckily for us, the only time we've come close to that nightmare is the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The alarming truth is that crises since then have also brought us to the brink of World War III. But in the nick of time, they've been discovered to be false alarms. Perhaps the most perilous incident happens on November 9th, 1979. At 3 a.m., President Jimmy Carter's National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, receives a shocking phone call.
He was warned that our early warning system detected a Soviet missile attack on the United States. And that meant we had maybe 7 minutes to figure out what to do to retaliate before the missiles struck. It was truly the doomsday scenario that everybody had feared since the start of the nuclear age.
The North American Aerospace Defense Command computer that watched and monitored all the sensors indicated that 250 Soviet missiles had been launched.
Brzezinski immediately calls President Carter, but within moments, the news from NORAD is even worse.
It was really 2,200 missiles had been launched, an all-out assault. And here's Brzezinski at home, sitting on the edge of his bed. What are we going to do?
That's when he gets the welcome news that the dire threat is just a false alarm, caused by a careless mistake at NORAD.
It turned out one of the technicians put a tape of a sample attack into a computer, and the computer started running that, and that was interpreted as an attack.
4 years later, the Soviets experience a frightening false alarm of their own. But luckily for the world, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov is the officer in charge that night. He's supervising an early warning station near Moscow. Near midnight, all is quiet, but Petrov knows that the Cold War tensions are running high.
In 1983, the Soviet leaders genuinely had some belief that Ronald Reagan, the American president, was a warmonger who was itching to launch an attack on the Soviet Union.
Suddenly, the station receives a signal from a Soviet defense satellite. 5 American Minutemen missiles are airborne, racing toward the Soviet Union. Protocol dictates that Petrov immediately contact the Kremlin, but he hesitates.
Petrov suspected that maybe this attack wasn't real. He didn't believe the United States would be attacking the Soviet Union with just 5 nuclear missiles.
Consulting the base's technicians, Petrov learns that no other sensors detect any incoming missiles. He fears that if he alerts his paranoid superiors, they'll launch a nuclear counterstrike in response to an attack that may not be fact, but fiction.
So Petrov, this mid-level Soviet officer, took it upon himself to do nothing. He didn't call the Kremlin.
If Petrov is wrong, he's just doomed his country.
Turns out, of course, that Stanislav Petrov was correct. It was a false alarm. And by not sounding the alarm to the Kremlin, he may have saved the world from nuclear destruction.
Later, the cause of the incident is discovered. The satellite had mistaken the light and heat from the sun for the hot exhaust gases of 5 missile launches.
These false alarms on both sides taught everyone a lesson that there had to be people involved in the early stages of a possible missile attack to keep from overreacting or launching a retaliatory attack for real against a false alarm. The 2 leadership groups began to talk to each other. CIA and the KGB set up a private channel where they could exchange notes and say, hey, we're not doing this. This is a drill. And it worked.
But the day-to-day business of preparedness in the nuclear age is a tall order. And although it sounds like fiction, one of our most vital nuclear security gadgets is named after something delicious we smother in gravy. The nuclear age took a new twist in the early 1980s, when the Soviets doubled down on their faith in computers. If all their leaders were killed, a computer would make an independent decision to launch a retaliatory strike. They called it the dead hand, and it was a little like the doomsday device from the movie Dr. Strangelove. They soon realized that that might not be such a great idea and scrapped it. But many speculate a semi-automatic version still exists in Russia. Here in the US, we've got our own unique system for launching a nuclear attack. And much of it centers on this 45-pound satchel, always within a few feet of the president. The story you've heard about goes like this. The ordinary-looking briefcase is the only one of its kind. Wherever the president goes, a military aide carries it, handcuffed to his wrist. Inside is the nuclear football, the electronic device featuring the red nuclear launch button. That football fairy tale fumbles away the truth, beginning with the inspiration for its colorful nickname.
The name nuclear football does not come from its shape. It's just an ordinary-looking, although pretty heavy, briefcase. Its name came from one of the American nuclear war plans, was nicknamed Dropkick. And from the name Dropkick, you got the name of the nuclear football.
Also, there's not just one football, but 3. And none of them are handcuffed to anyone. The president has one, the vice president has another, and the third is stored at the White House. But the president's the only one with the launch button, right? There's no button in any of them, just secret codes.
It does not contain by itself, however, the codes by which anyone could launch a nuclear attack.
The military, not the president, has the codes that actually launch our nuclear missiles. The football's codes are entirely different, and their sole purpose is to allow the president to confirm his identity with Pentagon officials when he contacts them. And that's where that security protocol, named after something edible, comes in. It's the all-important biscuit, a laminated card the president carries with him at all times, with codes that enable access to the football. With their biscuits in hand, our presidents will find in the football one final surprise: a list of targets and attack scenarios. We can thank JFK for that. He's the first chief executive to be accompanied by the football. And he demands alternatives to the all-or-nothing nuclear war plan born in the 50s. Retaliatory options now include using smaller tactical nukes designed to limit destruction. Whatever additional mysteries hide in this 45-pound satchel, its very presence reminds us of one profound thing.
The nuclear age is always with us, and there are a lot more mistakes and tight brinksmanship that occur that people don't realize.
But we may be moving in the right direction. By 2020, the combined nuclear warheads of the United States and Russia will number fewer than 8,000, down over 7 times from the 1980s. So to recap, the Manhattan Project aims not for Japan, but Germany. There's not dozens of nuclear tests, but thousands. It isn't just the Cuban Missile Crisis that pushes us to the nuclear brink, but incidents few even know of. And no red button to push, but 3 briefcases and verification codes. Pandora's box coughed up the bomb. Now we have to live with it. And we'll all do a better job of coping with the nuclear age if we can disarm the fictions.